global perspectives and psychedelic poetics is what it says in the propaganda, which I assume is simply permission to rave about whatever comes to mind. Global perspectives. I guess what I could say about this, from a psychedelic perspective, the thing that is different for psychedelic people looking at the global dilemma that we're in and that continues to deepen around us, is that it's, from my point of view, permission to hope rather than despair, because I think that processes, institutions that for 1,000 years or more have been building toward some kind of symmetry break, some kind of definitive self-revealing moment, that we now are turning final, as pilots say. We're now deeply embedded in the pattern. We can see enough of what's ahead of us to begin to actually feel the texture of the end of human history. It's no longer an abstraction. Even the straight people who own the world with their long-term and short-term projections, looking at population growth, spread of greenhouse gases, disappearance of the ozone hole, rising third world expectations, so forth and so on. When you propagate all these trends, it seems very clear that business as usual is no longer an option. Nobody's talking about that. So we're either in some kind of final, fatal meltdown of the values of Western civilization, revealed now after 1,000 or 2,000 year run to essentially be bankrupt, or we're going to transform ourselves unrecognizably. There really isn't any middle ground. The most radical and least likely future of all, it seems to me, is a future in which we continue just to stumble forward as we have been since the Industrial Revolution. That's no longer an option. And so then the question becomes a sort of a Gnostic conundrum. Is this the final act of some kind of great cosmic tragedy in which intelligence rises out of the slime, is shown to be inadequate and sinks back into the slime? Or is this a tale of difficulty overcome and heroism won? And are we going to be able to shed the monkey nature and shed the ego and actually move up to some kind of shining ideal? If you think of us as the descendants of the angels, this is a pretty tatty circumstance we've come to rest in. On the other hand, if you think of us as the descendants of shit-hurling apes screeching through the treetops, then it's pretty amazing what has been accomplished here. One of the dilemmas that I feel very strongly, and I'm just sort of talking off the top of my head here, because whenever a crowd is small enough, I sort of feel like I'm in my own living room. We don't have to have the pretense of knowing lecturer and, eager to be educated audience. The real challenge, I think, is trying to decide what is baggage and what is ballast that's going to have to be dumped. Can the future be a celebration of humanness as we have known it, meaning in the animal body with all its joys and pains, with all its frailty and potential for ecstasy? Or is what we call human nature somehow transcendental? And did we only rest for a moment in the monkey body, as once the cutting edge of evolution must have rested in the great reptiles, and at some earlier phase in history rested in the fish, and so on. Is consciousness something uniquely human, and must we keep the animal body with us? Is our destiny to become the gardener caretakers of a revivified earth? Or is the earth like a placenta of some sort that we have literally sucked all the nutrition and potential out of because we're on our way to some grander, higher domain of being? I don't have the answer to these kinds of questions. I feel it very poignantly. It's very poignantly focused in the psychedelic, in the experience of psychedelic plants and psychedelic shamanism, because, as any of you have followed my ideas on this know, I've spent a lot of time in the Amazon basin with human populations that seem to have struck some kind of dynamic balance with the earth. And yet the paradox of that dynamic balance is that when you take the sacraments, the hallucinogenic plants of these people, you're propelled into worlds of science fiction-like strangeness, transcendental dimensions of titanic implication. And then, at least I personally have come to the realization that this is how those cultures have chosen to deal with the Faustian impulse in human beings. It's been somehow confined in the domain of the imagination. We, meaning we who trace our ancestry back to Europe, are part of a different style, a different strain of human being, if you will. We are the idea excretors, not satisfied to have a canoe, a net, 5 fish hooks, and a bowl, but instead we take matter, we, Western civilization, Western technology, and we impress upon matter ideas, millions of ideas, cities like Manhattan, high-performance weaponry, enormous works of art. All of this is a kind of impulse, very strong in Western human beings, to bring the ideas out of the domain of mind and to somehow solidify them in matter. Permanence. The cult of the West is permanence. I always feel that when you can find the obsessive center of a society, you probably have put your finger on its central neurosis as well. I remember when I spent time in India, India is rife with talk of Shakti. Shakti is energy conceived of in various ways. It can be sexual energy, or it can actually be electricity flowing through wires is called Shakti. And I realized, being in India, that the Indian obsession with Shakti was a consequence of there not being any. That this was a society where energy had become the hardest commodity to encounter. And I think in the West, permanence is our great bugaboo, because we are born into the realization that everything is slipping through our fingers at the very moment that it comes into existence. The hardest psychedelic truth to assimilate, and you don't have to take psychedelics to assimilate this. If you just live, this will be hammered in on you again and again. And it's not, it's a cause for exaltation. It's a cause for despair. It's that nothing lasts. Nothing lasts. Not your fortune, not your misfortune, not your lovers, your enemies, your children, ultimately not even your own life and body. Everything fades. And so the Western response to this is the attempt to create something permanent, civilizations, enduring ideas, enduring institutions. All this is doomed to failure. And I see this Western obsession with the cult of permanence as a consequence of the Western obsession with ego. Ego, to my mind, is the very thing, if you had to somehow meld each problem into the next problem to try and reduce all problems to one, what you would eventually come to is the realization that ego is what is destroying us. Our inability to displace our loyalty away from the unique locus of space and time represented by our own bodies. Community, communalism, these are the things that we fear, that we repress, and that we at the same time struggle to realize. I mean, the collapse of communism on one level was the collapse of a repressive, nightmarish, paranoid social system. But the dream which lay behind that was a dream of community, of unity, of sisterhood and brotherhood. And the great concern now is that with the collapse of even a pretense of that position, that we are further fragmented, further atomized into individual competing microbes of greed and need. And this is precisely the attitudes which will push us ever closer to species extinction and to global ruin. Well, when you look at thousands and thousands of psychedelic experiences, to my mind, what you come away with is the notion that, no matter who you are, Amazonian shaman, Hasidic rabbi, nuclear physicist, the psychedelic will dissolve boundaries. It will dissolve your boundaries and force you to realize the commonality of the flesh. It's a startling thing to realize that really what you represent is nothing more than a point of view, and that we each are such a point of view, triangulating perception through what is essentially simply a nexus of our past history. We always are talking about the past and the future, but it's worth noticing that we all managed to get here this morning, this place, this time, and not one of us has the same past as any other of us. This moment, like any moment, is not a confluence of the past. It is a confluence of many pasts. And these many pasts come into a nexus of connection and then move on to become many, many futures. The reason I'm so interested in the psychedelic potential and willing to speak about it is because I think that the myth of our separateness, which was the glory of our institutional accomplishments, parliamentary democracy, individual rights, liberation of various classes and so forth, has now turned somewhat sour. There has got to be something more to it than just turning people loose to loot the planet so that everyone can pile up more and more stuff which doesn't satisfy anyway. And I think in talking about the future, what we have to somehow do is dematerialize the future. And there are several ways, or many ways, to do this. People have preached voluntary simplicity, and some people are into this. However, it's hypocritical to preach this in the third world to people who have nothing. We have everything, so we've seen the fallacy of condominiums and Mercedes, so then we preach this in Bangladesh. This is a bit disingenuous. The dematerializing of culture. Somehow, you see, what we have to recognize in the wake of the collapse of communism is that capitalism as well is a system with a fatal flaw that is set against human nature. Capitalism assumes an endlessly exploitable frontier of resources. This we have got not. So capitalism is now essentially, unless it can be radically retooled, an anti-human philosophy. It's literally chewing up the ground we're standing on. But there is nothing in the basic notion of capitalism that says that we have to be thing dealers. This is simply the style of capitalism that we have fallen into. Somehow, we have to dematerialize existence. And I don't know whether that means virtual reality. Some of you have heard me say that my vision of a perfect future is 25% of the present world population living in ecological balance, living in an apparently primitive, naked, aboriginal state. But when you step into the minds of those people and look behind their closed eyelids, there are menus hanging in bio-teleelectronic space. Culture, you see, can be downloaded into a chip installed behind the eyelids so that it is, freely commandable as an experience in the imagination. But if we insist on continually extracting resources from the earth and fashioning our dreams out of the stuff of earth, then our dreams are destined to turn to nightmare. It can't be any other way. So that's one thing about the future. The future needs to be dematerialized. And then, since people always accuse me of being a harebrained dreamer, I've tried to come up with something approaching a practical suggestion, and I took this need to the feet of the mushroom gods. Having been challenged by somebody at a talk like this, they said, well, you're always saying these mushrooms speak. Why don't you ask them how to save the world? And I thought this was kind of disingenuous, but the next time I had the telephone to hyperspace in my hot hand, I did make the inquiry. And the suggestion which came back, I think, is at least food for thought. The suggestion was, you want to save the world? You want to overcome male dominance, the momentum of consumerism, so forth and so on? Every woman should bear only one natural child. This is an interesting idea, whether you take it seriously as program or not. If every woman were to commit herself to bearing only one natural child, the population of the earth would fall by 50% in 40 years without war or famine or epidemic disease. If this program were continued for another 40 years, the population would fall by half again. This means in 80 years, the population of the planet could be reduced 75%. Why have we not heard anything about this, even for it to be denounced? I'm not saying it has to be embraced, but why isn't it a tiny fanatical minority advocating this? I think it's because it's inconceivable in this society to try and practice capitalism in a situation of retreating demographics. It also would be a solution which would place enormous power in the hands of women. Women are often heard to complain about their powerlessness. Yet here's a plan which requires very little input from white guys. I took this idea to demographers and said, what about it? This seems so simple. most people think there are no solutions. Here's a very simple solution. What about it? And they said, yes, well, it's more startling than you realize, because women in upper-class, high-tech Western society, a woman, say, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan or Malibu or the Seacliff district of San Francisco, a child born to that woman will have 800 to 1,000 times more negative impact on the earth than a child born to a woman in Bangladesh. If you were to go to Bangladesh and meet a woman in the back streets of Dhaka who told you that her ambition in life was to have 900 children, you'd think you were dealing with some kind of sociopath, a kind of typhoid Mary of the demographic scene. And yet every child born into moderately well-off yuppie families in high-tech societies is in that position. We prefer not to think of it this way. I think it's very interesting that one could make a case to women in Western societies. You could say, how would you like vastly increased leisure time? How would you like increased disposable income? And how would you like to take upon yourself a truly heroic social role? This is what's being offered with this suggestion to limit reproduction to one natural child. No more heroic, no more politically correct action can be taken. And interestingly, the women you want to convince of this position are the women you are most likely to be able to convince. Educated, white women with above average incomes. So that's a very practical suggestion, more likely to be implemented than my dream of lunar inoculations with psilocybin for the entire population to dissolve the calcareous ego formations that have sprung up in the bloodstream since the last full moon, which I also think would be a fine idea.